it cost me almost as much money as I made from my first full-length album, which, sold 80,000 copies. So it cost me almost everything that I'd profited off that album to defend myself. And I really brought down a Reign of Fire without even realizing it.
Yeah, without even meaning to.
Yeah. And that was like a 10-minute conversation. And it made my life very difficult for 6 years.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's a good lesson learnd, though, for sure.
Yeah. You think?
An expensive lesson learned.
Expensive and traumatic. But that is, that's what happens when you don't get these hard conversations out of the way.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
Well, hello there, indies. Welcome back. My name is Corrin Campbell. With me is Jack, and this is the Creative Juice podcast. You may notice that I have my therapy voice on today, and that's because we're going to change it up a little bit and talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and I think something that we commonly have to deal with as indie musicians. What do you think, Jack? You think this will be relevant?
I think it will absolutely be relevant, from band members to managers to record label people to producers and clients and anything else you could possibly imagine. This will definitely be relevant.
Totally. This week, we're talking about having hard conversations with difficult people. I think it's a conversation that I've wanted to have for a long time. And what's funny is that this has been brought to you by Clubhouse, and not in a sponsored way, but if you are on the app Clubhouse, you'll know that there are conversations happening in there, and sometimes there are difficult people. And so I definitely have had some of this experience even in the last couple of days. By the way, if you are on Clubhouse, we are working on getting a club approved. Of course, we aren't famous, so it might take a couple of weeks, but we're working on an Entrepreneur Indies club on Clubhouse, and we're super
excited.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So even while we're waiting for the club, though, I'm on there. My handle is Corrin Campbell, all one word. And Jack, what's your handle on there? My handle is just Jack McCarthy, all one word as well. Easy peasy. Yeah. So we're going to be going on there. Actually, the first one is tonight, but Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central on every Tuesday night is the plan to have a Creative Juice hang. I also have some plans to do some, positive, women groups, and we can have certain topics that we're focusing on. So, but first we're going to just do an icebreaker with the Creative Juice hangs on Tuesday at 7 p.m. So if you're on Clubhouse, please come follow either me or Jack so you can be notified until there's a club. And once there's a club, we'll be sure to start linking that in the show notes. But there are some difficult conversations that happen both in there as well as in our everyday lives. So whether that is your peers, whether it's someone you are working with, whether it's someone in your band, your producer, your manager, a record label, a publicist, a booking agent, a venue, it happens all the time. More often than anyone would like to admit or like to have happen. Yeah. Well, and especially because, music is such an emotion-driven kind of occupation, and so it's very difficult sometimes to have those hard conversations and not make it feel personal because it's kind of entwined in your being, And so I think that's one reason why we wanted to come live and talk about it. I think it's really important to kind of think in your mind about a plan before you get into these harder conversations. And Jack, I know, you've got a lot of IndieX clients. You work with wonderful clients, but also some difficult people, depending on who's managing their projects and things like that. So I think you are the very best candidate to kick off some of this discussion.
Pressure is on. Absolutely.
Bring it, buddy.
I would love to kick this off. Yeah. So like you said, Corrin, I've had over, the whole entire course of my professional career, doing anything really, from working at IndieX to working in other businesses and beyond, have certainly had a fair share of interactions that have been, high pressure or maybe what people would consider difficult, and with great people. I want to preface with that like you have to have difficult conversations even with people, and maybe even especially with people that you respect and care about and want to succeed.
Right.
So that's kind of I think that's a good way to kind of kick this off, is like a lot of times these conversations that you might need to have with someone that you're disagreeing with or trying to really drive the point home with or convince of a position that you hold. A lot of times they're going to be with people that you are in relationship with, in cahoots with, that you want to continue to be in cahoots with. And that's kind of where a lot of my kind of perspectives and standpoints start when it comes to this topic is, when you're faced with a hard conversation and having to have one, what kind of place are you coming from? Are you coming from an emotional, defensive place, or are you coming from a cool, collective, kind of team-driven place? And that's, personally where I try to, set myself and center myself is often in a place of being the guy that people want to be on a team with or want to work with. So that if you have something you need to say to me, you can come to me knowing that I'm going to try to approach things logically and calmly and, not overreact or immediately go on the defensive.
And ladies and gentlemen, Jack is very good at this. I have fewer skills in this department because I'm a very emotional person. I'm a rock artist, so obviously I channel some of my anger somewhere. But I've also had a lot of very difficult conversations in my life, and I've had battles, right? I've had some really aggressive confrontations, and it never bode well for me that I was going in it with emotion, and I think that's something that is really difficult to do when something's important to you and important enough to have a hard conversation. It's like, well, then how do I remove myself from this thing that pushed me enough that I have to have this conversation, right? So I think, one thing that can be very helpful is to know, and it's funny because it's kind of what we were talking about last week, but completely different, is knowing what your objective is, right?
Yeah,
do you want to crush that person's face? Okay, you're probably not ready for a conversation.
Yeah. It's funny. Just so our listeners can hear, before we hopped on the podcast and hit record, we were talking and you and I were saying, like, if it ever gets to a point where I'm personally acting emotionally and in that place, it's probably a sign that like the topic is something that we should walk away from for a little bit.
Right. And then I was like, we should start recording now.
Yeah. But that's the truth, really. Like and I think I know that within myself, that like my temperament is such that if it's getting to a point where, I'm emotionally backed into a corner, then I know that, it's a topic that needs to be walked away from and thought about a little bit more before personally I come back to the table with anything useful to say. And I've certainly seen that play out in plenty of situations, both, professionally and personally.
Right. Well, and this is something too, where, it's really great. We hear from indies all the time who obviously, and especially when you're independent, but really in any situation where you are, sharing a creation, you're writing together, you are, doing some project together. So with a producer, there are publishing shares involved, and there's all kinds of things that can come out legally if you don't have these hard conversations in the beginning. And it's so much easier to have these hard conversations when you still like each other than after you piss each other off and then have to try to come to an agreement at that point. That's not great. So, I think that's something that's important, is really kind of trying to see the future a bit. And knowing that even if you love somebody or get along with them or work together with them very, very well, that the sooner that you kind of check off these like potential worst case, like if this person flipped the script, became an entirely different person, what are some problems we could have? Like get those ironed out. I think especially with publishing and revenue share, that can be just essential because especially if you're a lyricist, right? And say you I'll give an example with my music. I sing, right? And I write the lyrics and I play bass. So bass isn't a great songwriting instrument all the time. I write riffs on my bass, but generally for the chord structure of my songs, I write on keys so that I can like figure out voicings and whatever. And then it's my guitarist who writes a ton of the riffs around those chords. So as far as like strict, copywriting rules as they sit right now, the way that those are lined out is that if you write the words and the music, you have created all the things that would be the copyright of that song, right? Outside of the recording, but in the pure writing side of it. But that's not totally true. And if I were to go to my guitar player and be like, yeah, you're giving all of this energy and all this writing to these riffs, but like, that's not the song as far as law is concerned. It'd probably piss them off a little bit because
that's a common one.
Yeah, it's a huge piece of the structure. So, I mean, that's something that's definitely good to get out in front of. And if you're an instrumentalist and you work with, a primary songwriter in your band, if you had to come back and duke it out legally later, you might not get credit for this because if that person wrote the chord changes and wrote the lyrics, you may have no leg to stand on, right? So that's why it can be really important in the songwriting process, especially, and then also, moving into publishing share. That's why that can be really essential to have that hard conversation up front when everyone's feeling gracious and working as a team.
Yeah, totally. That's a great, I think that's a great example of, coming to the table for the hard conversation early on, especially like, when a project is forming. Maybe you've just started like writing with somebody and, you've got a few songs under your belt together. I think it's healthy to have those conversations up front, as weird and as awkward and, almost, some people might think that you're trying to predict the future too much, but I don't think that that's true. I think planning for a bright future as opposed to like, oh, we're just writing songs and they won't go anywhere, so we don't need to have the hard conversations. Well, one, that's like forecasting failure, which is just like,
don't do that.
Not good for you or the universe. But also, it doesn't set you up to, really have a clear idea of what everyone's role is. And, just to share, kind of piggybacking off of that, I think another example of where these kind of conversations come into play and how you can set yourself up to, succeed in having them. I know a lot of my indies that are in bands will know this story well, but like people often say that being in a band is like being married.
For sure.
And I certainly have felt that way over the years in bands that I've been in. So I think like, in terms of like finding where everyone fits in role wise into the business of having a band is really important and sometimes a difficult conversation to have. And, there are a lot of egos involved in that.
Totally.
So that's another area of like trying to get ahead of like finding people's strengths. And this is something that I've often kind of sought to do. And shout out to my indies and Corrin, maybe you feel this way too, but like everyone kind of there's always one person that feels like the band mom or the band dad, kind of like the one who's lead. Yeah. Right.
I've never had that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, the person who's kind of leading the charge, even if reluctantly so. And I've definitely found myself in that position before. But I think, if you find yourself in that position, you are hopefully well equipped to see the strengths and the weaknesses of the people that you're working with, and then you can find, what roles and what tasks and things for people to be involved in match their strengths. And then bringing that to the table and bringing that to the conversation and being like, hey, Corrin, you're really great at, keeping track of all of our upcoming dates and really handling the booking side of things. Whereas, I don't have those relationships, nor do I have, maybe the interpersonal skills that I want to be negotiating that side of things. So there's a defined role, and setting up conversations, expectations, and, a path forward for all of those for the people that you're working with. I think that's a good way to approach it, is like, look for people's strengths and then talk with them about it. See what they're really into. And that kind of gives you a clear way of moving into it. Not that I'm an artist manager in any in any stretch, but I've certainly,
and Jack's DMs blow up.
No, thank you. Keep out of the DMs. I do not want to manage your band. You don't want me to manage your band. I promise.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, I think that's true. And, so sometimes this can come into like the first formation of a group, right? It's a common misnomer that the lead person, right, first off, is the one that makes all the decisions, obviously they're the ones who are getting a lot of love from the majority of fans or audience members because they're singing, which is a language that the audience can participate in, right?
Totally.
They may not be able to shred on guitar. And, I think this is why boy bands exist, is because then all of them have the potential to be the favorite.
Spread the love. Yeah.
Yeah. And bass players are, I the only reason I can get away with being a bass player is because I'm also the front person, but bass players always get less attention, right? So it can be, really important when you're getting into a project to define okay, there are going to be certain decisions that we make individually or in our lane or whatever, or we make no decisions that way, or something in the middle. It's okay, well, we should talk about anything like this, right? If it's artistic movement. And this isn't just in the album. This is in if money comes in for the band, do we pay other people? What are we paying for? Are we paying for at least their gas when they're, getting to the gig? Or are we buying equipment? And what happens to that equipment if we're no longer in this band? Who owns it? Things like that can be really important to actually get on paper,
Yeah, totally.
Something else too is, even when I have kind of launched out into tours with people, is understanding who is responsible for what portions of what's happening. So, and which is, kind of like what Jack was saying, but having it a little bit more defined, because there's always that band out on the road that's all right, someone needs to close up with the venue, and then there's this arm wrestle over who's going to do it, because
who's going to ask for the money,
right? Or who's going to do your merch payout or whatever,
Yep.
So there's a lot of things there that, if you define that going out on tour, maybe you put everyone on a rotation and you're all right, this person is going to, deal with the venue after the show, or this is the person that's going to pack up the merch, or maybe this team packs up the merch, or maybe we all do this, but having those conversations before you get out on the road and before you're exhausted and before things don't go as planned can help alleviate stress in other places. So that's another great time to have one of those hard conversations, because it's actually not that hard, and then you've already determined it, and then there is no hard conversation. You're actually, kind of limiting your exposure to a hard situation at that point.
Yeah, that totally rings true. You're having the quote unquote hard conversation that is preventing, harder conversations that you really don't want to be in. Like someone forgets to, close out with the venue and then you guys don't have gas to get to the next city.
Exactly.
That's, I think having those conversations up front, not only, shelters you from issues on tour, just, picking on tour as the example here, but also it sets up a level of trust, knowing, who's going to be taking care of things. It sets people at ease, which then just creates a healthier atmosphere.
Totally.
Which on tour is so important,
Yeah. You're tired. Everybody's patience can get shorter, as glamorous as touring is. I know plenty of people listening.
Oh, Walmart parking lots are so glamorous.
Right, exactly. Stopping at the Pilot and getting a Subway or whatever, So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a good time to have a conversation before you get into that situation, because once your patience is low and you're tired and you're exhausted, you're not really going to be open to, changing your mind. But if you're already kind of set in like the expectation, then you don't really have to worry about that so much.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great point. I think this kind of leads in nicely to another kind of concept or idea that I think is really important when it comes to having difficult conversations with people, is trying to be solution driven. Which I think, when going into arguments, let's just call them arguments for what they are.
Right.
A lot of people go in for the sake of arguing or just trying to make their voice heard, which, at times is understandable if you feel underrepresented or not taken care of or disrespected. I think there's a natural inclination to go in just, fists raised and guns blazing. But I think something that I've kind of learned over the years is, even when you're feeling that way, like if you're not trying to be driven towards a solution, well then what's really the point of having the conversation?
Right.
Defensiveness for its own sake doesn't really lead to a good outcome for anyone.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I've seen that plenty of times with interactions that we've had at IndieX with clients who, might, for example, have an idea of something that they want that really conflicts with something that we might feel strategically that they need. So where do you find middle ground, and how do you be solution driven about what you're trying to do with someone, and how can you find that? It's not even necessarily about compromise, more so just about finding the best path forward that respects everybody's desires.
Yeah, definitely. And this can be hard to achieve with difficult people, because they might see the way they're doing it or the way they want to do it as the only potential success story. So of course, in those situations, it's even harder, because you're having a hard conversation, but you're also having a hard conversation with a difficult person, with someone who is not likely to hear you, right? And so that's something that I've always tried to do, and I would recommend is before you go into that conversation, trying to understand the objective of that person, right? If they aren't a reasonable person, what is it that they're going to want to hear? And then how can you kind of present the point you're trying to make in their language? Right. And that way you're not having to be like, well, this is what so-and-so wants, so we're just going to do that. But instead, no, I know what so-and-so wants. I have maybe some hard opinions about that, or maybe I'm open to it, or maybe I'm only open to it under these conditions. But just knowing what their, sticking point is going to be, and then having some kind of answer, or at least the consideration for it. Right. Because if you go into it and this person is difficult and they don't immediately hear that point coming from you, then they're going to assume that like you don't understand it, or you don't know it, or you whatever, and that they are going against an adversary. And that's the worst place to go. And that is what a lot of difficult people think. They think, I know the right thing and nobody gets it, Yeah, totally. So it can be really good to be able to know what their objective is and be able to state that back to them, so that instantly they know that whatever they're thinking about is being addressed. And this it might not be something that they're consciously processing, but subconsciously, you've already made the point that they wanted to hammer home. So then the conversation has to jump ahead of that point being made. And so for me, that has been something that's been very successful in dealing with difficult people, so that you don't go round and round and round in the moment you already know you're in and not get past it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like that process of mirroring and letting someone know that they're being heard,
right.
even if what you're, I think what you said about repeating back to somebody what they're saying is so powerful, because they hear out of your mouth,
right?
That you're trying to understand what it is that they're saying at the very least.
Yeah.
In a best case scenario, you get that's right. That's what I'm feeling, or that's what I'm thinking. And then you've got a path forward. You have an opening, something to have a dialogue about.
Right. And so sometimes that can be done proactively, right? If you know what that is as you go into it. Another thing that I have found helpful in difficult conversations is when someone is expressing something that is unreasonable, right? And especially if they're difficult, right? They're going to say something that's like, you always, or you never, or, it's going to be some kind of extreme thing.
Hyperbolic.
Yeah. And then it's going to be tempting to be like, well, not always, because there was this one time, and that's just a road that's not progressive for anyone. So something that I have found to be helpful is when someone says something extreme like that isn't completely accurate, is trying to evaluate, what they would say if they were a reasonable person, and saying, okay, so if tell me if I'm right, you feel that this and this and this, and try restating the thing that they just said in some extreme fashion in a reasonable fashion, and saying like, okay, so if I hear you right, you think that you don't have enough say in how the guitar parts are being recorded because you're the drummer. Is that what you're saying? And then it gives them an opportunity to be like, yeah, like you guys think I just hit things, then you can say, all right, well, let's figure out a way to solve that, and that way it can kind of dig a little deeper past that difficult facade and, get to the heart of the problem so that you can move forward in the conversation.
Yeah, totally. And on that point of like, basically you're restating what someone might be feeling in words that resonate with them. Right. Another helpful practice that I've found to be, kind of useful is when someone has something that they're asking of you, something that they want you to do, or in a more heated case, demanding that you do.
Right.
Simply asking them like, well, how am I supposed to do that? And trying to garner a response from them to a path for, what they're asking you.
Sure.
Inquisitively asking, not in an accusatory way, just how am I supposed to do that?
Right.
Oftentimes that will reveal the impracticality of what they're asking you to do,
right.
Which then presents your solution as, if you have a solution or if you're about to present one, which then presents your solution as something that's more viable than, maybe the wild, difficult thing that they're expecting of you.
Right. Yeah. And there's been multiple situations in my life where, as a woman, I am just heard differently for some reason. Like I could say the exact same words as a man, and for some reason it does not communicate the same thing. And there better not be anyone in the room mansplaining for me, because I will most definitely crush that. But, sometimes there are situations where, whether it be your gender or your position in the situation, in the Army, for me, a lot of times it was rank, whether it's your age, whether it's how long you've been a part of the project, maybe you're a new person, that can be very frustrating. And if you feel as though you are a person in this situation that, say you're the newest member of a band, and they're like, well, what the bleep do you know? you're new here.
You're new. Yeah.
Right. Which I hate
the new guy or the new girl. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And so I think going into situations knowing that that's up against you can really cause you to, feel like you need to say it more aggressively because then they'll understand, and that typically doesn't work. And so I think understanding that if you feel that way, like self-examining yourself and being like, okay, I'm more emotional because they're treating me like an asshole because I'm a girl,
Yeah.
And just dealing with that anger as a separate entity before you walk into the room, because I've had to do that so many times. Where I'm like younger than the people in the room and I'm a woman. And so therefore I must be dumb. And then it only makes me more irate or less practical, less reasonable, and less able to negotiate whatever it is that I'm trying to get to happen. So I think that's another thing. If you're dealing with people who are, one of those, one of those people who is making kind of an unfair discrimination against you based on, again, any quality about you or the length of time you've been involved or whatever, is try to deal with that outside of wherever you're going into this conversation. As wrong as that is, like it's better if you just kind of try to put that to the aside, because as soon as you get through that hard conversation and past that moment, then you get to basically disprove anyone who was wrong about you, whether it was based on correct or incorrect items.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak to the sexism, obviously, that women face, especially in hard conversations, being mansplained and all the awful bullshit.
But that can happen
like
even
that.
if you're an artist dealing with a manager or a record label. I think there's a stigma there that like, well, you're new here. Like you only know your music and your artistry. And we've been doing this for hundreds of artists for this period of time. And, you can go through it in that way. Or, if you're like, if you're the singer that plays guitar and you have a guitarist and their focus is guitar and your focus is more support guitar while you sing, you could get treated that way because you're not the primary guitar player or you're not as fluent at the instrument, So there's a lot of situations where that kind of stuff can come down.
Yeah, for sure. You said age. Age definitely.
Oh, for sure.
Can play a role. I've certainly seen that. I think, just walking into rooms with people who have been doing things for way longer than you and maybe they're older and have a quote unquote higher, role, job title, whatever you want to call it. I think that definitely can play a role. And I've certainly felt that level of discomfort or condescension that can come up. I think what's benefited me in those kind of situations, apart from like what you said, Corrin, trying to separate and deal with those issues outside of that engagement, which, yeah, for sure, like that totally helps. Something else that is going back to what I said kind of at the beginning of this episode was just trying to walk in and be the team player, be the person that, act as though you're the person that everyone wants to be on a team with or have on their side. I think that can be really helpful to kind of stride in with that approach. It disarms people a little bit, doesn't, because I think oftentimes like these more discriminatory things can come up because people feel threatened. So disarming that can be, I think, helpful in the way you carry yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think another thing too is it can be good to find precedent, right? So if you're dealing with, whether it be a legal issue with your manager or label, whether it's people in the band, whether it's your producer, or especially if you're like arguing about revenue share, like, in a lot of cases, producers will take less upfront in exchange for shares of a song, right? Or, publishing rights to a song. In some cases, they charge you a buttload and expect a ton of publishing rights on the song. And so negotiating those things can be very difficult when it's just, I feel that's unfair, So finding precedent, whether it's, we see questions in the indies groups all the time about this, like what is normal? And there is, there's probably not any certain standard. But to avoid saying it depends, you can definitely find precedent all over the place. And really, if you can find precedent from places where this is something that's kind of proven and not something that happened last week and not something that happened a year ago, but maybe something that is from several years ago, and you've kind of seen the fruition of that agreement after the fact. Or, you can find precedent of where things went wrong, where these things were negotiated, right? There's always labels and management and artists in court and, things that aren't defined there, or certain terms that, didn't end up the way that artist thought it would, things like that. So taking a look at precedent that has to do with the kind of conversation you're wanting to have with someone can also be really helpful, because not only can you say, I have this concern, or, we need to talk about this or settle this. But then if they are dismissive or have a hard opinion, you've got some evidence to show like, look, even if that's what you think, there's also this evidence that makes what I'm saying not unreasonable,
Yeah.
That really can open up some dialogue at least.
Yeah, totally. That's a great point. Like, I think in hard conversations with whoever, the idea of like research and going in with evidence and ideas kind of goes out the window sometimes. It's all like pure unbrindled emotion.
Right.
And do your research, have at least some stuff to back you up.
Right.
And not necessarily to prove your point, but more so to, kind of like uncork the bottle of conversation.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I want to do one more thing before we wrap this up, because obviously this is a little bit of a different pace from our normal Creative Juice episode, but I want us to think of an example. An example of a conversation that we've had that could maybe have been improved upon with some knowledge, and kind of apply all the advice we just gave to ourselves in that situation. So I think I have one in mind, but Jack, do you have one in mind?
Ooh, I'll have to think about one while you while you go first.
I put Jack on the spot with this one. All right. Okay. So I'm going to share something about my career, which I've alluded to before, and this isn't necessary. I don't know if it's actually public anywhere, but gonna be now.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Spill the tea.
Yeah. So if you want to talk about age and gender and rank and, hierarchy, right? The job that I had in the Army was, as a spokesperson and a performer on behalf of the U.S. Army. And I worked essentially for a marketing department within the Army. And there was a person there who was the marketing director at the time. And he and I pretty much did not get along the entire 6 years I was there. But it was largely because of one confrontation that we had at the very beginning of my position there. And it was because he had a vision for a music video, and I thought that vision was stupid and pretty much told him so. And I was not considering, I was saying like, this is my brand. You don't understand this. You're old and you don't get it. And, you don't care about this music at all. And you're making this terrible Army commercial and nobody's going to like it. And it was very emotional. And there was probably some truth. I know there was truth in the things I was saying, but because I was, kind of pairing it with some of these descriptors and things, it wasn't heard, right? And so I wasn't able to really see like, okay, what does this guy want to accomplish? knowing more about him now, I'm not certain I could have changed any of that. But I certainly didn't go into it with kind of an idea of like, okay, we're a team here. What do we want to accomplish? This isn't just, about me, obviously. Like there's a whole bunch of people here trying to accomplish one thing. So what is the thing what is the objective here? And perhaps I could have said to him, okay, what do we want this video to communicate? Do we want it to be an Army commercial? The answer would have been no. He couldn't even have said that if he wanted to. So understanding what the objective was and trying to figure out, okay, you want to see this and I want to see this, but these are the things that we can kind of collaborate on to get to an objective that we both like. And, what it really ended up resulting in is that I pissed off this guy so much and he pissed me off so much that I ended up like having to get a lawyer and argue with the Army over whether or not I owned my own music. And it turned into, something that could be very similar to a management or label situation, which is that, you're arguing over who has the right to make this creative decision over something that is going on with your art, which is different from owning the music, So that's an example of where I definitely poured gasoline on the fire by not having the conversation as soon as I got that job, saying like, look, this is my music. I'm letting you guys use it. You have not made any investment in bringing it to fruition. And these are the terms by which you can use it. And if we'd had that in place, a lot of that wouldn't have gone, so it wouldn't have been so difficult. And even if it had been difficult, there would at least have been some expectation going into it. Like, okay, I'm probably going to have to sacrifice or compromise on these things, but I know that already, so I'm not going to be as angry. That's my story.
Yeah. That is a heavy one.
I'm
for
sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, it ended up costing me it cost me almost as much money as I made from my first full-length album, which, sold 80,000 copies. So it cost me almost everything that I had profited off that album to defend myself. And I really brought down a rain of fire without even realizing it.
Yeah, without even meaning to.
Yeah. And that was like a 10-minute conversation. And it made my life
That's wild.
Very difficult for 6 years.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's a good lesson learned, though, for sure.
Yeah. You think?
An expensive lesson learned.
Expensive and traumatic. But that is, that's what happens when you don't get these hard conversations out of the way,
Yeah, for sure. Well, I have a slightly less, maybe massively life impactful example, but related to expectations as well. And so I was working once with a client on their marketing, and, as clients do, challenges and questions come up in the process. And oftentimes when working with what I would call more difficult people, shrugging them off in the process and not addressing, concerns and questions and fears and wants and expectations as you go, and, kind of just trying to power through it, and just, keep momentum going, because that's often how work gets done. It's like, we just, keep our head down, keep working, push the questions off and just keep driving towards a result. That can cause similar to your kind of situation, Corrin, where it boiled to a head. That same sort of thing happened here where, at the end of a few months engagement, someone was very unhappy and expressing like, yeah, not stoked about how this went, feel like you don't care. And it boiled down to, at the end, a pretty difficult conversation of kind of trying to reset expectations that really could have been, taken care of and considered during the process. So, kind of a mea culpa moment on my part of not seeing these problems as they popped up over time and addressing them carefully and in a way that was considerate and really trying to be solution driven then,
Right.
and finding myself into a place where I needed to be, solution driven at the end to trying to find a path forward to be like, okay, we'll make this better for you. I know a lot of that is really vague, but for the privacy of the people involved, and it was a long time ago, but a tough conversation that came to a head with, eventually us doing some things outside of payment to make them feel taken care of, which, ended up costing money.
Right. Yeah. That, and you've done a lot of production work as well as been like a guitarist in bands. So you've probably kind of seen both sides of this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And it's funny how it just doesn't matter what side you're on of these, even if you're talking about these typical avatars, right? Both sides get emotional. And as much as it seems like, maybe a manager or a label is less likely to be emotional and they're more just trying to crush your face, it's actually, they're just as emotional. They feel like we've invested and we've done this and you're ungrateful. And, all of that stuff can really just come to a head. So more and more reasons to have these conversations early.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can think to another specific example before we sign off, just a simple one, like working as a producer and a mix engineer, especially early on in my career doing that, just kind of being flippant about what was and wasn't okay, setting boundaries. I think that's something that we didn't touch on here, but setting boundaries that, let people know what's good and what's not. And doing so, doing so prevents you from getting into blowout arguments about what you won't do for someone and what's out of scope.
Right.
I've had plenty of those conversations of like, no, you can't come back in to do another take of your vocals that you already did 3 times because you've only paid me $200,
Right.
That stuff, it's way harder to have that conversation after the fact.
Yeah.
when money has been passed between hands than it is having it up front and setting a very, very clear expectation and boundary. So yeah, if I can pass on that wisdom at all to anybody who's listening that does production work, set your expectations up front, have a contract, send an email.
Right. Yeah. And it can seem like all of this is excessive, getting things on paper and whatever. I think really, if there's one thing that I could identify as my mistake in the most difficult situations I've been in, is that there wasn't something representing an objective representation of a conversation I had. And
yes. So much yes.
So like a contract is, something that does that. It kind of personifies this conversation as something that is immovable and isn't going to be changed, right? You both look at it and you agree. So sometimes that can even, you don't have to have a contract. I mean, if you're in a band, you're not going to go to a lawyer and a notary every time you want to have a conversation, right? But, maybe formalizing your conversations a little bit, like the way that the board of a company would like have somebody taking notes,
Yeah, meeting minutes.
Exactly.
It sounds weird, but if you're going to take yourself seriously as a business, like you should do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it definitely can, because the thing is we're all human. We all hear things differently. We all process words differently. And a lot of times it's really tinted by who we are or what we want that to mean, So, minimum, I'd say at least when you have these hard conversations or before you have them, hopefully, you've got something where it's like, okay, I'm writing this down. We're both sitting here, and we're going to file this away. And if we need to revisit it, we were both present when I wrote it down. and we agreed
Yeah,
that that's what was, So I think that's another way to kind of hopefully prevent these situations in the future. So I liked that discussion. I think more and more as much as we get into digital marketing, and I love talking about that stuff, I think it's important also sometimes for us to, remember that we've got an entire community in, like, the Entrepreneur Indies group is incredible. The people that we talk to on socials are incredible. And there's just so much insight available into, like, these struggles that we all deal with that don't really have anything to do with marketing,
Yeah, for sure.
And so I really wanted to just touch on something that I know there's a lot of musicians that have to deal with this, hopefully not on a daily basis, but regularly. And it was really helpful for me to hear some of your examples, Jack, because now I know I'm not alone.
Well, same to you. I feel the same way. And I agree. I think this is something that's probably not talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's, especially right now, going into a new year, we're midway through January 2021, like setting the right foot forward for your partnerships, your relationships, whatever it is in your music career and your personal life. Like, if this helps anybody with anything, that's a win.
Right. Exactly. So if you haven't had hard conversations, go have them, get them over with.
Make that phone call.
Yeah.
Send that email.
Get it over with, wrap it up, and just make sure that you've got, your bases covered so that this need doesn't continue to nag at you. Because if you need to have a hard conversation and you know it and you're not, it'll make you more and more and more emotional until it comes to a breaking point. And, it's just not worth it. If as soon as you see something, just be like, wait, let's talk about this for a second.
Yeah.
Before you get too nagged on it. So I hope that was helpful to some of y'all indies. We have so much more to talk about. We're probably going to get back on our normal stride next week. Talk a little about the ones and zeros, which I love. So we'll be getting back into more digital marketing next week. But thanks so much for hanging out with us. Have those conversations, and we'll see you next week for our conversation on Creative Juice.
Can y'all really feel the East Coast, feel the West Coast?